share my screen. Today, I want to go back in time, and I want to begin where it all begins in the Old Testament. Like, if we're going to talk about why are we here? Why is there an Episcopal Church? Why are you having to suffer through confirmation with me on an early Sunday morning when you'd rather still be in bed, perhaps? Why do it at all? Well, we begin at the beginning. It all begins with the Old Testament. This is God's story, and therefore it is part of our story. The Old Testament is also super complicated, and so we can't think of it just as a book. We've done you a great favor, historians, theologians, people over the last several thousand years have done you a great story of they've done a great job putting it together in a nice, easy to read book. But it wasn't like this, right? It wasn't recorded as a book. Like, somebody didn't sit down and just write the Bible. It's a very long and complicated story. And each book in the Bible has a long and complicated history of how it became a book in the Bible. It was composed and written over, like, the Old Testament alone was probably composed over about 500 years. So maybe at the beginning, during the time of King David, that's when people started writing down books that we have for us. Around the time of King David, maybe they're writing the story of Moses. But, it's 400 years later when the prophets are writing their stories. So the prophet Habakkuk, which I know, Cynthia, I know you just love Habakkuk. Everybody loves Habakkuk. But, by the time Habakkuk is writing his story, it's 400 years later. So it's a huge period of time. It's like taking a journal from the boat when Christopher Columbus is sailing to America and taking like a sermon that I'm going to preach this Sunday, and you put them together side by side. You say, oh, this is part of like the great American story. And say, well, the sermon I'm preaching this morning is very different from the journal that Christopher Columbus kept. Separated, first of all, by 500 years. Second of all, written for very different purposes, right? Third, written in very different styles. Even if he was Italian being sent by the Spanish, so he's speaking a different language. But even if it was speaking English, it'd be very nuanced. The way they spoke English 500 years ago was so different from how we speak now. You think of the Old Testament, you can think of it as some big chunks, big different chunks. We're going to start with the primordial tradition. And mythology is not quite the right word, but it's also not meant to be perfectly scientific. This is like Genesis 1 through 11. We'll begin with this. But you imagine these stories weren't written down when they happened. These are stories that had been oral traditions, meaning like people told them to their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, and they survived for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before they're written down. So that's like the first 11 books of Genesis. But then we get to the story of Abraham, and it begins a new section that we'll call historical documents. And some of these are meant to be like history. Like, you have a journalist who's out there saying, what is happening? Who, what, where, when, why? You're trying to record the facts and trying to record it for, posterity forever and ever. Now, it's also written from the perspective of the people who are writing it down, right? And so from the perspective of the Israelites, the Assyrians are this great, evil, horrible people. From the perspective of the Assyrians, Israelites are these small, insignificant people who don't matter at all. The Assyrians are the great, glorious warriors of old. So, of course, Lucas, I see your nose really good, dude. So, of course, it's written from different perspectives at different times, but we'll get into history. And then there's poetry. Did y'all watch that amazing Amanda Gorman poem at the inauguration? I think it's one of the best poems I think I've ever heard, just as like American poetry. And she has another poem that she's going to read, I guess, today at the Super Bowl. And so I can't wait. One of my favorite things about Amanda Gorman, she said, she was doing an interview this week, and she said, people wonder if this is like capturing lightning in a bottle. She said, no, I like to think of myself as the hurricane that comes every year. Oh man, that's so intense. Get it, girl. And so poetry is important and significant. Poetry gives voice and gives us another way to express ourselves, and a way to tap into emotion and experience in a way that's really beautiful and strong. But poetry has to be read for what it is, and it's not necessarily historical documents. Then there's prophets. Now, there's two ways to prophesy. There's two different ways to be a prophet. One, we think of prophecy as like telling the future, like a fortune teller. So say, look, I'm a prophet of God. God spoke to me. The Chiefs are going to win today. It's going to be great. You don't need, put all your money on the Chiefs because I know the future. But that's not really what the prophets in the Old Testament are trying to do. The prophets of the Old Testament are not trying to tell you exactly what's happening in the future. They're trying to tell you the truth about what's happening in the world today. They're speaking with a prophetic voice about, especially to the people of Israel, about how they've strayed from God and how they're not living in line with God and the consequences of being out of line with God that can come down the road. We talk about that more in a little bit. And then there are parables or wisdom literature. We think if one of the divine attributes of God is that God is wise, that God is wisdom, that God is knowledge. The way that maybe sometimes God reveals himself to us is through knowledge. In the way that, like when I go and pray with people at the hospital, pre-COVID, when I was led into hospitals, like sometimes I pray for healing. And sometimes I also pray for doctors and the nurses and the caregivers to have wisdom. A doctor who spent his whole life training for this moment to know how to treat somebody, to bring them through a tough surgery or bring them through an illness. To say maybe the way God is healing this person, like, yes, I believe God can heal people. Boom. I also believe that a lot of times God works through the doctors and through the nurses, having given them the experience to learn and grow. So we think wisdom is one of God's, it's how we describe God. God is wise. And we have these wisdom parables to teach us about God's wisdom. Stories like Esther and Jonah and Job and parts of Daniel. Parts of Daniel are also prophetic and historical, perhaps. But we talk about the story of Job. It was one of the first stories to ever be written down. Job is one of the most ancient books of the Old Testament because people were telling the story and sharing the story as part of the Jewish tradition. They said, knowing this story of Job teaches us something about God and about us and about how we relate to God and how God relates to us. So there's different sections of the Bible with different genres. Oh, no, so boring already. My favorite thing, right, isn't just like sitting in class hearing about all this stuff. My favorite thing is to actually jump in to something, to actually go somewhere. It's like going on a field trip. So today, instead of just telling you about all these books, I want to take you on a virtual field trip. We're going to go visit these places that create the Old Testament. Let's see. Okay. Last thing I'll say before we take our field trip. The last thing. This is what Jesus read. Jesus didn't have a New Testament. Jesus was busy like making the New Testament, live in the New Testament. If we say, why do we need the Old Testament? It's like, well, to be Christian means to be a follower of Christ. And if we want to know Christ, we should understand what he read. When Jesus is quoting scripture, he's quoting the Old Testament. When Jesus is talking about God, he's talking about the God who is revealed in the Old Testament. So why do we read the Old Testament? It's so that we can understand what Jesus is saying. When Jesus gets up and is arguing with the Pharisees and Sadducees, he's quoting from the scripture. So there's not an Old Testament God and he's been replaced by Jesus. Jesus comes and says, I am the fullness of this Old Testament God. I have come to reveal God to you and to the world. And I am the fullness of God. I am the Spirit of God, the body of God here in your midst. And I read the Old Testament. So if it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. Okay, so now we're going to take a tour, a virtual tour of the Old Testament. Israel is really, 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 really small. Israel as a country is smaller than Rhode Island. Has anybody ever been to Rhode Island? Okay, has anybody ever driven from Huntsville down to, let's say, Montgomery? Okay, you've done like, you can imagine Huntsville to Montgomery. Now imagine there's like a direct line, which there is, like 65, Highway 65. There's a direct line from Huntsville to Montgomery. And that's about how long Israel is. And then if you just say, I'm going from that line to Mississippi, from that line west, That's about the size of the land of Israel, right? It's about 65. So it takes about maybe 3 hours to drive from Israel top to bottom. 3 hours from top to bottom. This is like the land of Israel. Now, in that 3 hours is all kinds of craziness. On one side, you have the Mediterranean Ocean. But Israel and the Israelites didn't like the ocean. That's where the Philistines lived. And even today, that's where like a lot of Palestinian areas. Now there is Tel Aviv, but down here is like the Philistine area. The Israelites were not sea people. As a matter of fact, the Israelites hated the sea, were terrified of the sea. The Israelites thought all bad things come from the sea. This is where like people go to die and great ships go to get wrecked. They were not seafaring people. So over here you have the sea, but that's not really relevant to our story. And then over here, on the far side of the east of Israel is Jordan and the Jordan Desert and then Saudi Arabia. I'm going to show you another map in just a second. This will make more sense. But it's like nothingness. It's not even sand. It's just rocks. It's like endless nothingness until you get to like China. It's just desert, all of Saudi Arabia, all of the Middle East. In between Jordan, that huge desert, and like Jerusalem, is this huge valley. It's this huge rift valley. It's the largest valley in the world. It's so deep that it's like literally the deepest, lowest point on earth. And so at the top of this valley is the Sea of Galilee, the Galilee Sea. The Sea of Galilee is very small. It's a very small little body of water, but it's the only water in Israel. And then the water goes down the valley because water rolls downhill. And that's the Jordan River. So the Jordan River is the only river in Israel. It goes from the top, from the Sea of Galilee, all the way down to the Dead Sea. Can anybody guess why it's called the Dead Sea? Because it's all dead. Because like there's so much salt and minerals that like nothing can live there. And it's very, very, very low. Okay, so that's not a great place to live either. You can't really live like at the Dead Sea. So some people live up here around the Sea of Galilee. That's awesome. You can eat fish, you can drink water, you can take a bath. There are people who live in the desert, but they're kind of like John the Baptist, who are like living way out there. And along that area is Jericho. We'll think of Jericho in a little bit. But then you have these hills. So then you climb up from the Dead Sea, climb up the hills of Israel. And in between the hills are these little valleys. And this is where the Israelites will live. They're going to live like in these little valleys, like the Valley of Jezreel, the hills of Judea, the hills of Hebron. That's where the Israelites are going to live. That's the good place, the place where you can like raise sheep and grow grapes and have honey. And this is the good life. So the area of Israel is actually very, very small. And the place you can live is very small. Now look at the world. Look at just like the world map. You see how big Algeria is, how huge like Sudan and Egypt. And even over here, you see Saudi Arabia is so massive. This map, you can't even see Israel. It's this tiny little spot right here on the side. Here's another map. I like looking at maps a lot because different maps give us different perspectives. Okay, so at the top of this map where it's green, right? That's like places where it's easier to live. That's like the good stuff. Over here where it's real green, this is Turkey and what we call Greece today. Greece and Turkey. And then over here is this boot is Italy. My people from Italy. So what's up? See how green and lush it is? That's the good life. That's where pizza's born. Greece, that's still the good life. That's like where culture is being born. Turkey, right? Living their best life. This is what we call the Fertile Crescent. You can guess this is the Fertile Crescent. When people are beginning, ancient people are beginning to create cities, they're going to create cities where they can live. They're going to create cities where they can grow food and like have agriculture. Like you can grow grain, you can make bread. Man, this bread tastes good. It's like way easier to make this bread than to like chase deer, every day of my life. So the Fertile Crescent comes really all the way down. It goes way up here, all the way down to Egypt. And you see all the silt. You can see where the Nile River is in a little green zone along the Nile River in Egypt. So down here's Egypt. Up here is Turkey. Over here is like Syria. Now look at all this. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, desert. Not a lot of people live in the desert. It's hard to survive in the desert. So people create these cities along these rivers. One of the first most significant people to live in the history of the world, one of the most significant rulers of the world, is this guy named Hammurabi. I bet Joel Porter knows all about Hammurabi. Hammurabi wrote something called the Hammurabi Code. You know, if you're famous enough, you could just name everything after yourself. The Hammurabi Code was like the first person to invent like laws and to like put these laws all across this area. Hammurabi was going to live in all this area way up here that's green. He's going to be over what was Babylon and Assyria, and he's going to impose a law. Say, like, look, if we're all living in cities, we got to play by some rules. Like, you can't just be killing people all the time. Like, you can't just like take whatever you want. If I have a bunch of sheep, you can't just come kill me and take my sheep, because like somehow that makes society precarious. Hammurabi's law we're going to see direct descendants of Hammurabi's law. We're going to see like the Jewish law that's given. Direct descendants of that is going to be even the US Constitution. Like the laws that we have in America, we can trace in some ways, in some form, all the way back to this dude. This dude was a builder. He's making cities. He's making all kinds of cities. Okay, so now my grandpa's very wonderful and like a great storyteller. My grandfather was Italian, and he tells stories about growing up poor in West Virginia, growing up in this big Italian family, how he'd walk along the coal tracks from school back to his house. And he lived in like a 2-bedroom house with 10 brothers and sisters and his parents. And along the way, they'd pick up pieces of coal that had fallen off the train, and they'd take that home to burn in the stove. So he tells the stories about how he grew up, about his life. My grandfather lived in a coal mining town. So I could walk out from his house and I could see these mounds of slag from the coal mines. I could see like coal still on the ground. I could see where the railroad tracks were that had carried coal from his house into his house. My grandfather would tell us stories about like where he came from and how his father had immigrated from Italy. He tells about stories of like the poverty in Italy and the hardship of Italy for our ancestors, and could trace his people back 150 years. And then he would talk about how before that they lived in Spain. And before that, he kind of went through time. And finally he'd end up and say, our people were the Chaldeans. And it was ridiculous. Like, this isn't 23andMe. This isn't Ancestry.com. I feel like my grandpa was like somewhat making it up, maybe rooted slightly in reality. But he's saying basically he could trace our people all the way back to Hammurabi, because that's around the time when Abraham begins. And Abraham is a Chaldean. Abraham is going to live kind of in this world that Hammurabi built. So we have to think of, like, I think of my grandfather as a real person. You think of your grandparents as real people, and your ancestors eventually, at some point, had come from someplace that wasn't America. We have to think of Abraham the same way. He was a real person that came from a real place in a real time. He was a Chaldean, and he was from this family that was called like a Semite. Now, Semite was like a whole different ethnic group from somebody. An ethnic group, right? Let's say like Eskimo. Let's say Eskimo people are Americans, but maybe the Eskimo people, the indigenous people who identify as Eskimos who live in Alaska, they look different from us, right? Maybe they have different traditions. Maybe even they speak a different language and eat different foods. They're still Americans. They're part of the United States of America. They live, let's say, in Alaska. But an Eskimo indigenous person is ethnically just different from me. You know, I don't know. I'm ethnically like white, hybrid American, maybe one time Italian. The Semites were similar, where they were people who looked physically different. It was a different ethnicity, but they lived in this Mesopotamia area. And in this Mesopotamia area, they had cities. They even had these things called ziggurats, which were like pyramids. And they had walls around their cities. And they had commerce and people living in the cities. And it was bustling cities. And it was exciting. So this is how Abraham begins. Father Abraham. The whole story doesn't even begin with him. It says God calls to Abraham's father, Terah, and says, Terah, I want you to leave this place. We want you to leave this city of Ur and begin a trip. Everything begins with Abraham. It's like the way that everything in my story, at some point, I think of my grandfather, because it's like my life history, my story. As Christians, our story begins with this guy, Abraham. Abraham was this dude living in the city of Ur. His father said, time to leave Ur. Look, way over here, way deep into the Middle East. He said, come on, Terah, let's go. And even though it was a long time ago, we shouldn't think of these people as unsophisticated. They had modern technology as they could possibly have at the time. They had modern cities as modern as they could have. And as Abraham is traveling, he is going to go to these huge cities. He's going to go and stop at Babylon. How do we know this? Because it's the only way to travel. He would have had to like get a caravan, load up his people, and it would have taken years, right? It says he and his father began their trip. They would have gone through Babylon. Man, we can go to Babylon today, dig it up. And like there's archaeology where we can see where the palaces were. He'd come up to Nineveh. Nineveh is where the story of Jonah takes place, that Nineveh is the heart of Assyria. And as a matter of fact, we see Assyria being this very real enemies of Israel over and over again. And then Terah, Abraham's dad, he stops at Haran. He's like, you know what? This is good. I'm all good. I'm kind of tired, pretty exhausted. I'm going to stop right here. And you see they're following these rivers, two big rivers in the Old Testament are the Euphrates and the Tigris. So they would have followed the Tigris River, stopped at Haran, and Haran is going to be the place where Abraham, he leaves from there, but it's where his son Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's where Isaac's son is going to flee to Haran. It's where Isaac, Abraham's son, is going to find his wife Rebekah. Haran was this huge city where all kinds of commerce and people buying and selling stuff. And it was where all the caravans from the whole world would have converged on Haran. So Haran's also a really cool place. But then Abraham keeps traveling. Now, Abraham never really stops traveling. His whole life is basically one big trip. He comes down and finally finds Israel, right? He finally finds, it's not Israel this time, it's just land. It's just, people living there, but it's kind of unclaimed land. He's going to travel all the way down into Egypt, see what's going on down there. There's a famous story where Pharaoh takes Abraham's wife for a little bit, and like, it's a complicated story. You're just going to have to read the Bible. It's really exciting. We spend some time there. But then basically Abraham will go and visit every little nook and cranny in Israel. There are very few places that Abraham doesn't go. And all along the way, he's building little monuments to God. He's building little altars. He's saying, God is calling me to come to this land, to settle this land, to like claim this land as like my land. And it's Abraham and his son Isaac who are going to settle here. And then it's going to be his son Jacob. Jacob is going to be transformed. He's going to have this really intense experience, and his name is going to be changed from Jacob to Israel. That's how the land gets its name. It's named after the dude. Like I said, if you're important enough, they just name it after you, right? So they named the land Israel. Israel, Jacob had 12 sons, really 13. And they divide the land into the 12 tribes, saying each one of my sons gets a plot of land, and each one is where his family can grow. And it covers this entire span of Israel. Now look, Israel, I was saying, was so small. Israel so small. You can drive across Israel in 3 hours from top to bottom. You can see the whole thing. It's so small. And yet it's really clutch. And yet, if you live anywhere way up here, like Babylon or Assyria, or way over here in Turkey, or down here in Egypt, it's the only way to get from point A to point B. You have to walk through Israel. So if you have like an army and you're like, we want to go invade Egypt because Egypt is awesome and they have super cool statues and we want to take all their statues. Or like they have really good, workers and we're going to go steal those people and enslave them. You have to march through Israel. So to get anywhere in the world, you have to pass through Israel. Otherwise, you're passing through the desert, right? You can't march through Saudi Arabia. It's like, hey, let's wander in the desert for 3 months where we're going to starve to death and die of dehydration. That's a terrible idea. So we're going to follow the only walking path we possibly can along the Mediterranean River. So if you want to go to Africa, anywhere in Europe or the Middle East, you have to go through Israel. So Israel is the crucially significant place. And so this is where Abraham settles. It will be renamed after his grandson, Israel and the 12 tribes. Now, you remember the story, or look, I'm giving you an overview. You need to read your Bible every day. The Bible is fantastic, and the Old Testament is fantastic. You should be excited to read your Bible every day before school, 10 minutes, or you're eating your Cheerios for 10 minutes. You just read your Bible before you go to bed. When you say your prayers, 10 minutes. You can read the Bible in 1 year if you're just doing 10 minutes a day. And like the most exciting place to start is with Abraham. Really, the beginning is wonderful, but you start with Abraham, and it's a good story. It's a story of his life, of his people. So you need to go back and read the Bible. But his son, his descendant Joshua, right, is sold into slavery because his brothers hate him. His brothers get so angry because Joshua's kind of annoying and pestering them all the time, saying how special and cute he is. They sell him into slavery, and he has all kinds of wild experiences down here in Egypt. And while they're in Egypt, he eventually goes and gets his brothers and brings them to Egypt as well. Say, this is the place where we can have food, where we can have our families grow. And eventually they get so big that the Pharaoh, the evil Pharaoh, enslaves them. And this is when God will raise up his first great, massive prophet, Moses. And Moses is going to be born as a Semite, still that ethnic group. He's going to be born as this Jewish descendant of the man Israel, but he's going to be raised in Pharaoh's court. He's going to battle it out with Pharaoh and leave across the Red Sea. This is what we think is one possible, route he took. It's hard to say exactly, when you're kind of following the details of the Bible, and also thinking that Moses wandered for 40 years. So he might have hit some pit stops that we're not seeing here, but he went down through the bottom part, right, of the very bottom of Israel, the land that connects Israel to Egypt, along the Red Sea. He's going to hang out at Mount Sinai for a long time, get the 10 Commandments. And when he's there, it's going to say, okay, God, you freed us. We're no longer slaves. So now how do we live as a people? How do we live as a society? How do we care for each other? How do we be a community, a civilization? And they must have been aware of Hammurabi's code, so they knew what it was like to have laws. So God is giving them this new law of how to live together as a people. Eventually, they're going to go all the way up here, past the Dead Sea, and they're going to come to the edge of the Jordan River. Now, the Jordan River, the Sea of Galilee, is very beautiful and very lush. The Jordan River near the Dead Sea is kind of deserty and isolated. But the people are going to cross. Joshua is going to cross the Jordan River. You see how here they are. They come all the way around, the Israelites, and they're coming over here on the kind of right side or the left. They're coming from the left bank they're going to get to the left bank of the Jordan River. They're coming from the right side of the Jordan River. So Joshua is going to cross over the Jordan River, and it's not big. It's not a great rushing river. It's a fairly small river, but Joshua's going to lead the army across it, and they're going to go into the town of, anybody know? I know Panda knows. Jericho. This is like modern day Jericho with a little picture of what Jericho used to look like. Jericho is an ancient civilization. It was famous for its walls. First thing they're going to do is they're going to come into Jericho. They're going to sing and shout, and the city walls are going to crumble. And Joshua is going to lead the people in and say, okay, now is our time to come into this land and to take over this land that God is giving us and that God is leading us to be a nation, to be a free nation. When they leave Jericho, they're going to have to walk through the desert. Oh my gosh, it'd be terrible. This is a picture in that desert, not far from Jericho, on the way to Jerusalem. And for the parents involved, this is like where the Dead Sea Scrolls are found, where people like John the Baptist are going to live. This is like where John the Baptist is just chilling, living his best life out in the desert, minding his own business, writing scripture, preaching sermons, burying scripture in the sands to be lost for 1,000 years. They're going to wander through the desert. This is what the desert of Israel looks like. Just nothing. And then they're going to come up over the mountain. And when you come to the peak of the mountain is the Mount of Olives. And even Jesus is going to hang out at the Mount of Olives. Even today, we can go hang out at the Mount of Olives. They're going to come up over the Mount of Olives and descend into what, and this is where David will begin, it will plant his city, but this is the Judean area, the area of Judah. The tribe of Judah is going to settle here. And David is going to plant his city. It's going to be called the city of David, the city of Jerusalem. And in this city is the first time that David is going to unite the whole kingdom. David is going to, like, from the top of Israel to the bottom of Israel. It is one kingdom for his lifespan. David isn't the first king. He's really the second king. But he's the second king. The first king, though, that will unite the whole of Israel. Israel is finally a country. But actually, Israel isn't a united country for very long. David is not just the king, so his job is to, like, protect people against enemies, protect people from each other, protect people and from also false gods. King David is also kind of a religious king. His job is to make sure people follow this God, the God of life. When King David dies, it's going to be split. There's no longer a kingdom. There's going to be two kingdoms. There's going to be the southern kingdom, where his one son, Solomon, is going to take over. There's going to be a northern kingdom where another son is going to take over. In the southern kingdom, in this area of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is built up on top of the city. Because, like, if you're an ancient city, where's the best place to put a city to protect yourself is up high, so you can see your enemies coming, so you can defend it easily. That's why you build it on top of a hill. And they built on top of a hill called Mount Moriah. And it's all connected. Friends, everything's connected. Mount Moriah is where Abraham is said to, he was going to sacrifice Isaac. God's calling Abraham, asks him to make the sacrifice of Isaac, takes Isaac to the top of this Mount Moriah, and there's a strange rock right in the top of Mount Moriah, and on that highest point, he's going to make the sacrifice, and God comes down and rescues him. And on that point, on that rock, this strange rock outcropping of the highest point of Jerusalem, which is the highest hill all around Judah, that's where King Solomon is going to build his temple. It's like, okay, we're finally here. God has led us here. God has blessed us with land. And so now we're going to build a temple to worship God. And the Spirit of God says, like, the Spirit of God, like fire and smoke, moves into the temple. And you can actually see, like, that God is now in there. And there was, in the very heart of the temple, in the very center of the temple, there's the Holy of Holies. There's a throne where God would sit on top of the throne. And the throne was actually called the mercy seat. That God sits on the mercy seat, resting in his throne room. And they would close these curtains, these, like, purple fabric curtains. And these are the curtains that when Jesus dies, it's these curtains that will be ripped apart and fall down, kind of symbolizing that God is no longer in the temple at all. But that's the second temple. It's a complicated story. But Solomon builds this temple, and people can look and see that God is with us. Now, outside the temple was huge, this giant plaza, and they'd offer sacrifice. And the sacrifice was kind of like a giant barbecue. Y'all, I mean, I know y'all like barbecue. Somebody just dropped me off a Boston butt that their lacrosse team was selling yesterday. I'm so excited to go home and eat this entire Boston butt by myself. You guys know what I'm talking about. When you would sacrifice in the old days, you would take, like, let's say a cow to be sacrificed. Or let's say, not a pig, because Jewish people wouldn't eat pig, but let's say a cow. You take a cow. You give it to the church. The church, this would have been my job, would kill the cow in a very special, sacred way. And then that meat would be cooked. And the smoke that would go up, that would smell really good, nice barbecue, that would go to the glory of God. The meat would go then to some for the priest would eat some, maybe you'd eat some because you brought it. But then the meat would be given to people who are hungry. The meat would be given to, like, the widows and the orphaned and the sick and the poor people in the community. So when I would make a sacrifice to God, when I would give my offering to God, that offering would be used to, like, help people and sustain people. It'd actually be used to bless people so they could actually sustain people who are hungry or sick. So you see out here like a giant barbecue where they're making fires, and there might be other areas where they're burning incense, but they'd also be sacrificing and redistributing it. So around this area, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. Inside the temple, this is where the priest, like the innermost sanctum of the temple, you can see here, is very ornate, and it was covered in gold, and it was beautifully designed. You can actually read the instructions on how to design it in the Bible. It tells us all kinds of amazing things. And you can go today and still see signs of where it was. Now, this was, an image of today. If you go to Israel today, this is something you can see. This is the Wailing Wall. We went like 2 years ago. It's right there. This is what King Herod had rebuilt. So what you're looking at is kind of walls that King Herod had rebuilt because the temple had been torn down by the Babylonians, like where King Hammurabi was from. The Babylonians are going to come and destroy the first temple, and it's King Herod, the King Herod who wants to kill Jesus. It's that King Herod who's going to rebuild the temple. And you can see this wall right here was just like the base of the wall. On top of the wall is like the whole plaza where the temple was. And where you see the Golden Dome, this Golden Dome isn't that old. It's maybe 600 years old. And it's Muslim because of world history events that may be complicated right now. But that's where the temple had stood, around that area. We don't know exactly, was it right here? Was it right there? Was it to the left a foot or to the right 2 feet? I'm not exactly sure. But that's the area in that crazy rock outcropping where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. That's where it was, on top of that rock. This is the place where the Holy of Holies was. This is the place where Solomon had built his temple. And there's this great huge plaza that's huge up here. This is where Jesus would have gone and like thrown out the money changers. This is so big. I don't know if y'all been to an Alabama football game, but Alabama Stadium can hold about 100,000 people. And this plaza can hold about 100,000 people. Now, I don't think there's 100,000 people that go to Toomer's Corner in Auburn after an Auburn game. I don't think there's 100,000 people that go to the Quad in Tuscaloosa before game. Well, there's like a lot of people that go to those places, like tens of thousands of people. But 100,000 people is like being in the Alabama Stadium where it's filled up, pre-COVID stuff. Every single seat is full. That's how many people could be walking around in the plaza, buying things, selling things, buying animals to sacrifice, exchanging money to make those sacrifices, maybe where they're getting baptized, or washing themselves ritually. So this wall is called the Wailing Wall, and it's just a retaining wall. And you see here on the right side of the picture, this is like a tunnel they've built to walk in. So if you want to go up onto the plaza, you walk in along here, you walk all the way in. Now the plaza, for the last couple hundred years, has been controlled by, I don't know like which organization within Islam, but we'll say Islam. It is under Islamic control. So like as a Christian American, I can go up onto the plaza. I can actually go to the Dome of the Rock, but you're not allowed to do things that offend Islamic sensibilities. So like last time I was there, I went and I like put my hand on the Dome of the Rock and said a prayer because it's like, oh my gosh, I'm so close to like the Holy of Holies. And then like all the secret police came running out and like made us leave. So they were going to arrest me if I like said any more Christian prayers on the Dome of the Rock. So learn my lesson. Don't do that again. But down here, so that's like Islamic control, but down here is like Jewish control. And this is like one of the most holy sites in Judaism where people come and say their prayers. And now what people like to do is get buried as close to the temple as possible. So this is looking at it from one side. Now, if you go to the exact opposite side, you're looking at it from another angle. And these at the bottom of the picture are all tombs where people want to be buried as close to the temple as possible. These are all Jewish tombs being buried. And this is called the Mount of Olives. This is where Jesus is going to be partying with his friends, celebrating the Passover the night he's going to be arrested. Down at the bottom is this valley, the Kidron Valley. You see it's a little valley because like up here's a wall and the hill goes down, and here's the Mount of Olives and it goes down. So it's a little valley. That's the Kidron Valley. And over here where there's like trees, that's like what they call the Garden of Gethsemane. So this is the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's where Jesus is going to be saying his prayers when he's arrested. He's in this olive grove, this grove of trees, literally looking at the temple. So he's going to be arrested right here, and they're going to carry him into the temple property and into the city where he's going to be arrested and then crucified on the other side. So this isn't just Old Testament stuff. This is also New Testament stuff. So far, all the books in this kind of area I'm talking about was the first 5 books of the Old Testament. It's the historical books, kind of all the way through 1st Kings, 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. This is also where David is going to write a lot of Psalms, and other people are going to write Proverbs, and some of the books of wisdom are going to be recorded. When King David was in charge, man, look at all this territory. He was responsible for this dark kind of blue area, but his control went way north and way south, and he had kind of this relationship with other kings. But I said, after King David, the area is going to be split. There's going to be a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom, and they're not going to really like each other. And some of the books of the Bible and some of the prophets of the Bible are written in the northern kingdom, which, surprise, is the north. And some are going to be written in the southern kingdom, which is obviously in the south. Now there's going to be like 2 rival kingdoms, and they don't necessarily get along with each other. Like, even though they're cousins, it's kind of like where I'm from in West Virginia. You know, this famous West Virginia and Kentucky are famous for having these feuds, these like blood feuds, like the Hatfields and the McCoys, where they live across the state line from each other. They're all cousins. They're all interrelated probably, but they just hate each other, and they're kind of fighting with each other. Well, in the northern kingdom, there were 10 tribes. In the southern kingdom, there were only 2 tribes. That's how it makes 12, 10 plus 2. The northern kingdom is going to be destroyed and never return. At some point in your life, you may hear stories of the lost tribes of Israel. And this is what we're talking about. The 10 tribes of the north. They're destroyed. They're destroyed by the Assyrians. The Assyrians are going to come in, and they're going to take the best and the brightest and the smartest and the most beautiful and take them back to their kingdom as slaves. And they're going to kind of burn the rest and then just move in their people to take over cities and towns. And so the kingdom of Israel, which is the northern kingdom, is no longer really ethnically pure. It's now like not just Semite people, it's Assyrian people as well, and people who kind of met and bred with and like had children with the Assyrians. And then there's the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. That's where Jerusalem is. And this is where the Babylonians are going to come in later. And the Babylonians, like maybe 100 or so years later, the Babylonians are going to come, and they're going to ransack Jerusalem and destroy Jerusalem. But it's where the Israelites are going to return to Jerusalem, rebuild Jerusalem. And this is where Jesus is going to see the new temple built by King Herod. It's all complicated, right? World history is complicated because there's all these people. There's Egyptians and the Hittites over here in Turkey, and the Amorites over here in the Middle East, and the Hittites and the Assyrians and the Babylonians way down here. And they're all going to be vying for power, one after another after another. And Israel is going to be in the way. Every time there's a fight, every time people are waging war, Israel's going to get caught up in the middle. So you can see in the pink arrows, when the northern kingdom, these guys, and the blue guys of the northern kingdom, they're going to be carried off by the Assyrians way over here, way up here. And then you're going to see the Babylonians, they're going to carry people like David back to Babylon.
Okay.
There's a lot of information. I'm covering like all of world history and all of Israel history, in a short period of time. But when they get carried to the this kind of the new Babylon, it's going to be this fantastical city. This is where Daniel's going to be taken. Daniel's going to be taken to Babylon, and he's going to see like one of the great wonders of the world, the hanging gardens of Babylon, this incredible city. It's like so sophisticated. They built like these rivers to go around it and these forts, You can see like a pyramid where they'd worship false gods. You can see like these palaces where the king would live. This is where David would go and live in the palace. It was this massive, massive metropolis. And today, if you go to, like, let's say Iraq, this is a picture taken by a soldier who fought in the Iraq War. And he took it from the palace that Saddam Hussein built. And from the palace where Saddam Hussein was living, you can see they're doing archaeological digging and discovering, and I think some of this is like drawn on, the ancient walls of Babylon. It's like still there. Like the people who live there still live there. Like a civilization still exists. Saddam Hussein was obviously like an insane dictator and a terrible human being. You can ask your parents about who he was. But like he built his palace over kind of this ancient palace. And the civilization that never went away. It just kind of evolved. Okay. So now we get to the time about about Jesus. King Herod is a builder. King Herod loves building stuff. So King Herod is building cities on the sea, Sea of Galilee, along the coast. He's building ports. He's building fortresses that will name after himself. And he's going to rebuild the temple. King Herod is not a Semite. So he's not ethnically exactly the same as the Jewish people. However, he was raised religiously Jewish, and he's going to marry a woman who is part of the Jewish royalty. So King Herod is going to call himself King of the Jews. King Herod, though, has made a deal. It's like a political deal because the Romans are really in charge. So the Romans are in charge, but they said, King Herod, you can call yourself king. We don't care. As long as you pay a bunch of taxes to us, keep everybody under control. King Herod says, great. So he rebuilds the temple. So the temple that Jesus sees is going to be the second temple. And it's going to be massive. This is the area where all the people from, Alabama and Auburn game could come together and be. You see this giant plaza, and right in the middle is the area where they would worship. That's like the Holy of Holies. This is the place where God should be and God should be dwelling. And you can see like this gate where people would walk in. And on the other side is the city, the great city of David. We have like just enough time. I want to show you like this video. I think it's this video. A quick overview just to see the land of Israel. Like I just want you to see what it looks like so you can kind of feel it. 4 minutes.
Now, the books of Joshua and Judges that open the Deuteronomistic history, these books recount or relate the story of the conquest of the land of Canaan by the Israelite tribes and the early years of the settlement. That's in Judges. To gain an understanding of some of the issues involved and the emergence of a tribal structure in the land, it's helpful to know something about the geography of Israel. It has often been pointed out that in the past 4,000 years, more wars have been fought for the possession of the tiny strip of land known as Canaan or the land of Israel or Palestine than have been fought for almost any other area in the world. And in the ancient world, the reason for this was that this very small rectangle, it's about 150 miles long and 70 miles wide. It's about the size of Rhode Island. It's a very small rectangle, lies on the way to anywhere worth going in the ancient Near East. You've got Egypt over here. You've got Asia Minor up here. You've got Mesopotamia over here. Not a tremendous amount of inherent value in this strip of land, but it's important for where you could go by traveling through it. So you have 3 main trade routes that cross the country, and they were used by trading caravans that would carry gold and grain and spices and textiles and other goods between Egypt and the rest of the Fertile Crescent up into Asia Minor. So control of these international highways brought a great deal of wealth to the area, but the central location was a double-edged sword. Because in times of peace, it would bring prosperity. But of course, in times of war, the land was perpetually invaded as armies would crisscross the land, going off to do battle with the great powers. So on their way to conquests in Egypt or Asia Minor or Mesopotamia, armies would tramp through the land. And that explains the succession of rulers that have held the region. The Egyptians, the Amorites, the Israelites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Greek Ptolemies, the Seleucids, the Romans, and the list continues as we go on into the medieval and the modern periods. Now, despite the fact that this is a very small piece of land, it boasts great geographical diversity. So there are three main geographical subdivisions, and they really run in strips from north to south. First, on the west side, you've got a low coastal plain. It's about 20 or 30 miles wide. It's the coastal plain, and that that is the main highway out of Egypt or down to Egypt. That area was controlled by Egypt at the purported time of the Exodus. Running north to south next to that coastal plain is a region of low mountains. These low mountains are cut by some valleys that sort of run east-west. You'll see one there, the Valley of Jezreel in particular. That was a particularly fertile valley. So the valleys that cut through the mountains are extremely fertile. The plain of Megiddo also joins with the Valley of Jezreel. That's the most fertile part of the country, but it was also the site of many of the most bloody battles in Israel's history. Then next to that north-south central hill country, you've got also running north to south, what we call the Great Jordan Rift Valley. It goes the entire length of the country. And the Jordan River runs through this valley. It rises in the Sea of Galilee or the Kinneret in the north, and then it flows about 65 miles, I believe, down to the Dead Sea. At the northern extreme of this rift, the Rift Valley, is Mount Hermon, which is the highest point. It's a snow-covered Mount Hermon, and that's the highest point in Israel. It rises about 10,000 feet above sea level. The central mountain area, those are between 4,000 and 10,000 feet above sea level. As you move from the central area over to Jerusalem, Jerusalem is about 2,500 feet above sea level. But then as you continue moving east towards the Rift Valley, that area is dramatically lower, and you feel it as you travel the road there, just how quickly it drops, so that by the time you get to the Sea of Galilee, you're 700 feet below sea level, and the Dead Sea is nearly 1,300 feet below sea level. That is the lowest point on the Earth's land surface. So it's a dramatic drop in just a very short geographical area. Up in the north, the river is surrounded by very lush vegetation on both sides, but there's no life 65 miles south down by the Dead Sea. This is because the water is 25% salts and minerals, although I hear they found some sort of bacteria or something there. So I guess I shouldn't say anymore that there's no life, but essentially there's no life we would care about in the Dead Sea area. So it's a very desolate area, and tradition identifies this as the site of Sodom and Gomorrah. The area around the sea is basically semi-desert. We call this the wilderness of Judea, between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, the wilderness of Judah or Judea.
So exciting. I know. I think this is wonderful because as you begin to read the Old Testament, you can kind of see in your mind and understand a little bit better kind of what's happening in the world. The Old Testament is trying to tell us the story of wars and famine and plague and pestilence and destruction and of hopefulness and of life, and of God always breaking through that to reveal God's self. Of even in these like crazy times, in these wars and these global wars, that God is making himself known, that God is revealing himself again and again and again. That God reveals himself to Abraham, and God reveals God's self to Moses and to these judges who will follow Moses. And then God will continue to reveal himself to the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. And then God will continue to reveal himself to the prophets all the way up to the time of Jesus. And so I want you to start reading the Old Testament, and you start at the beginning and read this as stories that are happening. And they're trying to tell, like my grandpa is trying to tell me stories of my family. This is a story of our family, of how our story begins as Christians, and how God is continually breaking in to the real world to share messages of hopefulness, messages of grace, messages of God's presence with us. In the same way that when I preach on Sundays, I'm trying to talk to you about how God is breaking into our world today, how God is breaking into the world in February 2021, how God is alive and real now. And so, do you have any questions? I know I just covered 4,000 years of geography and world history. But do you have any questions for me about the things that we talked about?
Josiah, have you heard the Bible in a Year program?
Bible in a Year is a great project. It's a great way to read the Bible, and to follow along. You can, If you come to church for 3 years in a row, you will be exposed to the entire Bible. We read the Bible in a 3-year cycle. That's why we read these readings every single Sunday, that we cover the entire Bible. There are some portions that are cut out, like some of the lists, of names and things. But you can read the Bible in 10 minutes a day. If you read 10 minutes a day, every day, you can read the Bible in a year. That doesn't mean you'll have great understanding of the Bible in a year. But that's why you got to keep coming to Sunday school and to church to gather and gain insight to that. There's a story where they see this eunuch, one of the disciples sees this guy reading the scripture, and he's like, hey, do you know what you're reading? And the guy's like, no. He's like, well, let me help you understand what you're reading. So that's in part my job. It's in part Brandon's job. Definitely Lou's job. She's off to my right over here, to help with more understanding, because sometimes the scriptures are complex. Other questions about world history, about God? So I wasn't talking too heavily about God and how he's revealing himself in these stories, but that's kind of like the next step, right? First, we root it and say this is very much a real history of people, of lives. All right. Well, next week, we're going to pick back up and say, so here's this real history and this real geography and this real land where God is making himself known. So how is God making himself known? And then how does God make himself known in this person? How does God become this person, Jesus? So we'll talk more about this. All right, friends, go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks be to God.